Hello class, this is my multimedia presentation for week 2 on market failures, and the market failure that I chose to discuss is the housing and financial asset bubble crisis of the early 2000s. So according to our text, there's 6 basic market failures: imperfect competition, public goods, externalities, incomplete markets, imperfect information, unemployment, and other microeconomic disturbances. The market failure that we're going to be discussing today is going to deal with externalities as it affects the housing market. Externalities are basically the actions of one individual or firm affecting the action of others. In the case of the housing market, the actions of lenders, banks, and financial institutions had a greater effect on the entire economy, which created the market failure. So let's get into the market failure of the housing market. Uh, in the early 2000s, investors began seeking alternatives for treasury bonds, and the housing market seemed like a viable opportunity for investment. Uh, so investors backed mortgage-backed securities. These securities were given a AAA rating. However, new information was coming into the housing market that was not yet understood, and the AAA ratings were still being given out, enticing investors to these mortgage-backed securities. So as these mortgage-backed securities became a hot topic or hot item for investors, the prices in homes went up. And as the prices of homes went up, the demand also for homes began to go up, and lenders began to increase the supply to facilitate the demand for these mortgage-backed securities. Lenders increased this supply by giving loans to unqualified borrowers, which is often referred to as subprime lending or subprime mortgages. Prior to the early 2000s, it was difficult to get a home. You had to have good credit, employment history, but then prior to the collapse of this housing market, through subprime mortgages, they were lending to unqualified buyers or people that couldn't afford these homes that they were getting into, or they could initially afford them, but then when the payment would balloon, they were forced out of their homes. Lenders were also engaging in what was referred to as predatory lending, where they were issuing mortgages without verifying income, and they were going off of what was referred to as stated income. And as prices began to go higher and higher, uh, the uh, the increase still maintained, creating a bubble. Ultimately, what happened is that people that got into these homes could not afford their homes, either because they got into them on stated income and maybe didn't actually have the income to secure the asset they were purchasing, or they couldn't afford their home once the payment ballooned through an adjusted variable of interest rate. Uh, and when these people couldn't pay for their homes, that's when the bubble popped. The prices of homes suddenly went down, and houses went empty. The supply, be it people seeking mortgages, um, was not there, and there was plenty of homes available that were now empty, but no one who could afford to get into these homes. So the demand for homes went down, and ultimately a recession hit, creating the collapse of our financial markets. And ultimately, the government had to step in this market failure. The federal government stepped in and contributed over $250 billion to bail out banks who had now these defaulted mortgages. The federal government sent accountants to various banks and lenders that were in need of assistance to audit their practices. And if their practices were in line and they weren't engaging in some of these predatory behaviors, um, they backed the banks so that they did not fail and provided them with essentially a bailout. Later would come the bailout of General Motors and the automotive industry as well as a result of the recession. And ultimately, in response to this market failure, the federal government had to step in and create regulations that would enable an event such as the housing market collapse to happen again, and enact new policies that did not exist prior to this to get away from the subprime mortgages and the predatory lending that ultimately created the collapse of the housing market. Well, that's the end of my presentation. Here's my references here, and I appreciate everyone for taking the time to watch, and I look forward to watching your videos.